So good afternoon. It is a real pleasure to meet today to present our book, Forced Displacement in Conflict Scenarios, Ethics and Human Rights Perspectives. I would like firstly to thank the authors, presenters, colleagues and friends that are here with us today. Briefly, to open this book launch, I will present a short introduction. We will then have two special international main speakers, Brinton Likes and Rui Nunes, and afterwards, Eduardo will give a brief comment on the book. To close the event, we will have a question and answer session. Please send your questions using the Zoom chat. Y lo digo en español también, para quienes quieran enviar sus preguntas, Laura nos ayudará con la traducción. So, the book brings together the research work that authors worldwide have developed around forced displacement in conflict settings, from different perspectives that have the peculiarity of being located in multiple geographies where the crisis of forced migration sadly unfolds day by day. The Mediterranean Sea, the Mexican-US border, Colombia, Guatemala, Nigeria, and Afghanistan are some of the scenarios addressed in the different chapters. In this sense, this editorial project was a perfect occasion to start a conversation in which, through its encounters and contrasts, had made it possible to approach some answers to a complex problem that challenges our societies in an increasingly pressing way. In the different chapters that composed this book, crucial subjects on the topic were addressed. Forced Displacement, Ethics and Health, The Case of Colombia by Eduardo Díaz Amado and Andrés Cubillos. Forced Migration Film as Testimony by Juan Jorge Michel Fariña and Eduardo Lasso. Affective Contestations, Engaging Emotion Through the Sepour-Sarko Trial by Brinton Likes, Alison Crosby, and Fabienne Doiron. Mental Distress and Gender-Based Violence in Forced Displacement Settings from Conflict, Ethical Considerations for Healthcare Professionals by Ayesha Ahmad. Health Priority Interventions for Internally Displaced Children in Nigeria by Grace Madu, Joshua Istifanus, Usman Nafisat, and Nawako Bilkisu. European e-health responses to crisis migration, a critical appraisal by Oliver Finney, Gabriele Werner-Felmayer, Elena Sipi, Marcus Freihat, Silvia Zulo, Ursula Bartexko, Lars Ursin, Shailin, Heikki Felsman, Dusanka Krajnovic, John Saunders, and Boik Rakic. Europe in the Face of the Refugee Crisis by Magnolia Pardo and Hector Romero. So, these are the chapters of the book, and you will have the chance when you have the book with yourself to see that in the different lines that make up the book, you will find the role that legislation, legal frameworks, and political systems can play in offering solutions to this crisis, not only regarding urgent matters, but also on the structural and strategic aspects that must be considered in the medium and long term. The consideration of the political, economic, and social crossings in the conflict scenarios discussed in this book allows the authors also to delve into the consequences that forced displacement brings to the field of subjectivity. As we understand it, ethics is a practice of thought that invites us to the complex but urgent exercise of making what marks of our time thinkable. I would like to highlight the value of the experiences and analysis proposed by the different authors, and we, Eduardo and I, especially thank them for their significant contributions that made it possible for this project to materialize. Finally, I would like to mention that when this book was in the editing phase, we were surprised by the war in Ukraine. As of June, millions of Ukrainians had to flee their homes, and once again, we are confronted with shocking images of long caravans, refugee camps, devastated cities, and death. So this book on ethical and social issues in situations of armed conflict and displacement seems to be sadly timeless. Refugees and displaced population demand ethical sensitiveness, solidarity, and concrete actions from states, international bodies, institutions, and individuals. We expect, that is our hope, that this book will contribute to a better understanding on this critical problem, but most importantly, that will help to conceive new appreciations and possible solutions. After this brief introduction to our book, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Brinton Likes. She's a professor, community and cultural psychology at the Lynch School of Education and Human Development, and she's also a co-director at the Center for Human Rights and International Justice at the Boston College in the US. I will give the floor to Brinton.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and thank you so much for this invitation, and my warmest congratulations to Andrea and Eduardo for this wonderful volume, Forced Displacement and Conflict Scenarios, Ethics and Human Rights Perspectives. And gratitude to the many co-authors who've been able to carve out time during these difficult years that we've been living over the past, and to create the opportunity to reflect on these important issues. It's critically important in this moment to recognize, as has been documented in this volume, the millions of international migrants and refugees and those who accompany them. This number of folks on the move has grown by some 49% since 2000, nearly double the rate, as most of you know, of the growth of the world's populations. My colleague and co-director at our Center for Human Rights at Boston College, Dan Canstrom, writes that today we are homo mobilis. Despite the non-gender sensitive non-neutrality of the Latin, it echoes Andrea's claim that the right to move is an important human right. And it is that bioethics calls us to address in multiple ways. For in addition to those who travel based on choice or work or leisure, as many of us on this Zoom call, there are tens of millions of irregular migrants, including those who cross borders without permission, who overstay visas, and many others in various complicated statuses, including the internally displaced. As is described in many of the chapters, but particularly in those on Colombia and Nigeria and on the European Union, many of these migrants have endured what Chami described as desperation migration, or that Betts offers the definition of survival migration. This global phenomenon reflects, as this volume suggests, restated claims of a new sovereignty through which nation states increasingly assert their rights to exclude. And it's reflected in many other processes and practices that include expansion of exclusion, detention, and deportation systems by nation states, the so-called voluntary returns that we see at the US-Mexico border, self-deportation programs, which is basically based on making them so miserable that they want to leave, xenophobic mob violence and authoritarian demagogues in many parts of the world, the outsourcing that takes place through bilateral cooperation, so-called, and international training, technology, and idea sharing, among other processes, and regional and global exclusion and deportation. In addition to documenting some of these lived experiences, the chapters note a range of responses that seek to break the above practices. Among those noted in multiple chapters are our international human rights law, and in particular, people call attention to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which in Article 1 says that all human beings are free and equal dignity and rights. But Article 13 notes that everyone has the right to the freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state, the right to leave any country, including his, or I say her, own, and to return to that country. That is, we are not guaranteed the right to move into other countries. Thus, we see the human right to leave and one's return to one's own country, but not the right to be recognized in another. Although the international community has not sought to revise its criteria for asylum to include migrants forced to move based on impoverishment or climate disasters, the UN has recently separated the approval of a non-binding global compact on migration that is discussed in some detail in the final chapter of this volume. But as Andrea suggested, we are called in this context to be creative, to reference our ethics, and to think bioethically, as she noted, about these issues. That is, as she describes, a practice of thought that invites us to the arduous but urgent exercise of making what marks of our time thinkable. Drawing on the network of academics, practitioners, and policymakers who seek, among other things, to respond to these crises and to gather in networks and meetings and institutes developed to prioritize and privilege bioethics, the volume can serve as a compendium of multiple interdisciplinary perspectives focusing on legal, political, environmental, health, and psychosocial dimensions that both constrain and facilitate forced migration. Moreover, the editors sought to reflect some of the multiple ways in which, despite their commonalities and what seems like a universality in many of these experiences of forced migration, they are, in fact, deeply particular, deeply contextualized, intersectional, and culturally and linguistically imbued. And many of the chapters point us in those directions. Thus, the explanatory systems that seek the causes of and responses to forced migration must also be deeply universal, but profoundly particular. Several authors in the volume operationalize this through drawing on psychoanalytic theories to frame the interstices of the universal, the particular, and the individual, whereas others narrate experiences that are what I would say from the ground up, that is, in the words and through the images of those who are living experiences on the move. In the few minutes that I have with you today, I will briefly discuss some of the contributions I have found in these chapters, but also try to organize my reflections around what I would argue are three ejes, or axes. The first has to do with methodological priorities, the second with ethico-onto-epistemological assumptions, and the third with praxis, or the doing and the acting. So first, the methodological priorities. Perhaps one of the most straightforward ways of thinking about these methodologies within and across the chapters is Carlos Nubia's excellent foreword, where he distinguishes research on from research to. Or another way of thinking about this distinction is reflected in the chapters that offer a panorama of the problem by presenting findings from quantitative research that confirm both the explosion of those on the move in the 21st century, and also note and call our attention to the internally displaced, who were really only recently recognized as migrants by the United Nations towards the end of the 20th century. And yet are the majority of migrants, as we learn in the chapter in Colombia, and also in the co-editor Eduardo's chapter with his colleague, and that on Nigeria. In contrast to these methodologies, Aisha Ahmad and Alison Crosby and Fabienne Doiron and I echo the contextual grounding in history and culture noted in those chapters, but speak more about generating knowledge from the ground up as we researchers engage in dialogic relationality with migrants through developing, either through feminist power or through focus groups, just enough trust to engage in in-depth interviews, creative workshops that draw on traditional cultural expressions, as well as drawings, dramatization, and storytelling. Thus, positive models of studying down seek to confirm causal relationships while recognizing the profound limitations of such linear models, whereas qualitative methodologies are grounded in intersubjective co-constructive strategies of knowledge construction that seek through critical reflexivity to keep the story centered on the knowledges of migrants, refugees, and internally displaced. Those ways of knowing and of representing what can be known are further reflected in the chapter by Juan Jorge, Michel Fariña, and Eduardo Lasso through their explorations of film as testimony. Through their critical interpretations of multiple films centered on forced migration and other forms of multiple gross violations of human rights, they have given rise to multiple exoduses from homes. They offer, in their words, and I quote, to propose an encounter between psychology and art, which undertakes through different avenues the arduous task of transforming what is real into symbolic, and thereby of inscribing what appears to be impossible. So I would argue that this methodological diversity confirms the critical importance of interdisciplinarity while challenging us to think about what my second essay argues, that is the ethico-onto-epistemological assumptions underlying these differences. Each of the approximations reflected in the above chapters confirm one of the important goals of this volume as I read it, and that is the challenges facing the 21st century of Homo mobilis that transcend deeply embedded, sometimes polarized debates within the academy about objectivity and subjectivity, and urge a bioethical approach that offers possibilities to not only transcend these polarizing debates, but to press them towards alternative ways of knowing, being, and doing. As the editors note in their introduction, they have invited a diverse group of academics and practitioners from a variety of disciplines. We also reflect policymakers, NGO administrators, university professors, and health researchers, many of whom work at the intersections of traditional, disciplinarily grounded fields of praxis. Despite the diversities evident in the chapters that draw on Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalytic theory versus those that draw on feminist or Marxist theorizing, the vast majority of our chapters reflect knowledges grounded in a Euro-North American intellectual tradition that is rooted, I would argue, in Cartesian dualities that have deeply grounded our ways of being and knowing, and also of thinking ethically. And as argued in some of these chapters, the knowledge systems are primarily privileged in a global neo-colonial world that continues to exercise systems of power over indigenous, Afro-descendant, and impoverished communities, among others, whose ways of knowing and being continue to be marginalized due to the multiple legacies, not only of genocidal violence, but also of what Ventura del Sousa Santos, among others, calls epistemicide, or attempts to destroy their ways of knowing. So despite these forces, and in some way because of them, I have had the privilege of working among indigenous and original peoples over many years, and with members of these communities have begun to understand the knowledges that are pushing upwards into our northern academic arenas. And we are increasingly aware of knowing and being that transcend, contradict the dualisms of the West. Time does not permit, nor would I be the best person to do so, to discuss in great detail what the feminist physicist Karen Barad refers to as ethico-onto-epistemologies. Drawing on the urgencies articulated in the final chapter of this book by Hector Romero Ramos and Maria Magnolia Pardo Lopez, that we need a new language to actually understand and to respond to the crises of forced migration in the 21st century. I'd like to briefly draw our attention to some of these ways of knowing that are emergent from multiple communities in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa and beyond, whose survivance, in the words of Native American scholar Visinor, is grounded in an alternative ethico-onto-epistemology. Those of you in Colombia are well aware of this as you witness the multiple ways in which indigenous communities and judges, including Izquierda Belkis, are pressing for the defense of the rights of territories, of waters, and of lands, arguing in line with the UN Convention on the Rights of Indigenous People that living beings are, in fact, rivers, mountains, and territories, not only humans. This understanding is reflected in the drawings and dramatizations of the Maya Kekchi, about which Allison and I and Fabian wrote based on our 8 years of work in Guatemala. And in what the Maya scholar Shirik Garcia notes, that the Mayan cosmovision fosters a holistic understanding of things, does not divide events, but rather emphasizes the interrelations among the psychosocial, the environmental, and the cosmic towards an integral approach to people and reality. Or Fermino Castillo, who describes the Ischil's conception of reality based on biocentric ontology, ontological connections made between the Ischil and their territory. Or our Lolita Chavez Ichakik, who notes that when we say that plants speak, the trees speak, that stones speak, the mountains speak, it's because we listen to them. What we ask of humanity is that we all listen to the voices of the land, the air, the earth. They are talking. This is not to romanticize or to generalize across all the diversities within the Mayan communities, nor across the various diversities among indigenous communities, but rather to think the challenge of a bioethics is to rethink this project. How do we weigh what marks of our time thinkable, an arduous challenge today? Multiple chapters in the book highlight the challenges facing migrants on the move, while also documenting the conflicts experienced by health and mental health professionals who all too often lack the cultural linguistic skills, as well as the material resources to respond more effectively to those on the move. But the deeper resistance, I would argue, comes from the discourse of borders and what some have called the new sovereignty, that is the right to control who can enter, who can belong. These contemporary practices reinforce policies and practices that I would argue, particularly in the United States, have existed since our country was formed. The Statue of Liberty in New York City's harbor welcomes with one hand, but it expels with the other. And that welcome has always been deeply racialized. And yet, as discussed in this volume, these and other practices of expulsion are increasingly widespread, and as argued by multiple authors, have been strengthened in recent decades, despite more positive, seemingly collaborative moves such as that of the European Union. Many have identified the limits of the criteria in international human rights law, particularly vis-a-vis how we define asylum, excluding those on the move who've been displaced by impoverishment or by climate catastrophes. Others note the number of countries that have refused to actually sign on to the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which is, in the words of the President of the UN General Assembly, and I quote, the first global framework for global governance and international cooperation on migration. And this non-binding cooperative agreement, approved and ratified relatively recently, is a notable achievement, but clearly limited in scope and potential reach. Drawing on the work of many, I suggest here, based on these chapters and the work of others deeply concerned about forced migration, that we refocus our ethical reflections and resituate ourselves, or what Gloria Anzaldúa, the Latina lesbian feminist theorist, calls nos-otras, that is, a praxis of doing and acting. She noted that she had crafted this term based on a hyphen or a dash between the nos and the otras. The nos is the subject, the we, that is the people who were in power and colonized others. The otras is the colonized group. And then there is the dash, the divide between us. And I quote her, she says, what is happening after years of colonization is that all of the divides disappear a little bit out because the colonizer in his or her interactions with the colonized take on a lot of their attributes. And of course, the person who is colonizing leaks into our stuff. And so we are neither one nor the other, but we are both. We're not a pure other. There is no pure subject. There is no pure object. We are implicated in each other's lives. As Crosby, Doiron, and I note in our chapter, Léa Granic extends this idea of the hyphen. She urges those of us who are researchers to engage in what she calls an epistemology of the hyphen. That is a recognition of the ways in which researchers and participants, therapists and clients, are in hyphenated dichotomous positionalities that reflect rather an intersubjectivity. Self and other are not opposite ends of pulsing lines, but a constant process of co-creating each other in a research dynamic or a clinical practice dynamic. We are fundamentally interdependent. She characterizes the intersubjective relationship as, I quote, a different type of hyphen, co-created, one that moves between and among the researcher and the participant, the researcher, and then the broader audience. Interconnection, intersubjectivity, mutual vulnerability, empathy, and care. Working the hyphen has taken multiple forms within activists and organizing circles. Paul Farmer, the medical anthropologist and physician, talked about what he called, and I quote, pragmatic solidarity in the formation of a Partners in Health organization and in multiple of his books. He drew our attention to the attitude and praxis that connects us across chasms of difference and implicates those who have a socializing influence on others. The scope and length of these relationships are not determined by the powerful, he writes, but rather by those on the ground, those from below. My colleague Dan Canstrom, not a Catholic, in fact, in terms of his origins Jewish, draws on the words of Pope Francis, who called for a valuable lesson, and I quote, in solidarity, appealing to those in possession of greater resources, to public authorities, and to all people of goodwill who are working for social justice. And he says, never tire of working for a more just world marked by greater solidarity. Both fraternity and friendship are inseparable, argues Pope Francis, and they are both equally vital poles in our society today. They both call for an acknowledgement of the worth of every human person, always and everywhere. And perhaps more relevantly, he argues, no one then can remain excluded because of his or her place of birth, much less because of the privileges enjoyed by others who were born in lands of greater opportunity. The limits and borders of individual states cannot stand in the way of this. Thus, this volume challenges us, as do many of the practices in which we have been engaged through research, through policy, through critique, to put one step in front of the other and move roughly forward toward the pluriverse described herein. Thank you very much, and congratulations to all.
Thank you so much, Brinton. As I invited you in the start of this Zoom meeting, please, if you have any question, use the Zoom chat so we can address the question after all the presentations. I will now want to introduce our next speaker, Rui Nunes. Professor Nunes is a full professor of bioethics of the Faculty of Medicine of the University of Porto in Portugal, and he's the Secretary General at the International Chair in Bioethics.
Well, good afternoon or good morning to all of you. It is really a pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm a professor of bioethics. I'm not a specialist in this area, although it is a very important one. I congratulate all the authors, but especially Werner-Felmayer and Eduardo Diaz-Amado for this excellent book, a very important and actual book that should be read because, as Andrea said, we are now facing this problem worldwide, but namely and especially here in Europe, in Central Europe, so it's more actual than ever. Professor Brinton made an excellent presentation of the book, so I'm going to make only some comments, general comments, that as a professor of bioethics, I feel I have the duty to make. This book has, as already mentioned, different chapters from different authors. I know them, some of them very well, and I salute and congratulate them. It is a pleasure to meet you again, although by Zoom, but nevertheless, it's a pleasure meeting you again. Different realities all over the world, in Central America, in Colombia, in North America, in Africa, in Europe, in Syria. So it is a global phenomenon that we should deal with. But the problem is rather the same. How should humanity deal with these migrations, some of them forced migrations? How should the law, the national law, international law deal with this phenomenon? It is a growing problem. It will be even grower when we know for sure that climate changes if we do not take appropriate measures, will exponentially aggravate this phenomenon, namely in Africa, as you know, in Sahara, in Sahel. It is a huge problem because we have a huge population that is growing exponentially, but in the near future, if nothing is done, it will be a migratory population. So in the absence of the lack of an international world order, I will speak about it in a few minutes also, I think this is one of the hugest problems of humanity. And because they are brought together, because migration, welfare, environmental changes all converge in the same results. So, from my perspective, what is the bioethical problem? I think it is really a bioethical problem, because in a secular democratic society, so this is my starting point, in a secular democratic society, ethics is grounded in fundamental values and principles that I feel that we all share, but nevertheless they should be reminded in this setting. First of all, that everyone has his or her own dignity. So this Kantian perspective of a full human being that is entitled to have some recognized ethical and legal human rights is a good starting point also to deal with this issue of migrations and forced migrations. And of course, taking also into account that, as Brinton said, that we are, human beings are relational beings. So in bioethics, usually we like to strengthen the autonomy of the person, the self-determination of people, but we live with other people, we live for other people. So no one of us can live by his own, by her own. So this relational dimension, I feel it is very important to stress and to cherish also. Of course, that we believe in human rights, we believe also in fundamental values of modern democracies like non-discrimination, and non-discrimination in this set of very vulnerable people, I feel it's a value that has an intrinsic power that I should like also to stress. And also it means that in some way we should follow principles such as solidarity that has already been spoken about a few minutes ago. It is usually not so well perceived in modern societies, namely in more open and liberal societies, but it is a very cherished value that, at least from my point of view, is also a good starting point for this discussion and all the topics of these different chapters of this book. I think that this book also addresses an important issue, that is the women human rights, because, as you know, and it has already also been spoken of, there are usually in these circumstances intersectional discriminations. For instance, being a refugee, being a woman, and being a victim of traffic. As you know, one of the problems that we are seeing in Ukraine, in the refugees in Ukraine, and I suppose anywhere in the world, is that these refugees are more prone to being victims of traffic of every kind. And so we have here different problems that in fact come together, and that should remind us of the importance of dealing humanely with this issue. So, stating that, my deep concern reading this book is what should we do? What are the answers that not only bioethical reflection, but reflection from scholars from different fields should suggest? What should this group of people that is attending this Zoom conference propose to try to diminish the impact of this huge global problem? I am especially fond of the democratic and perpetual peace theory of Immanuel Kant. And I think that in part, as this book also reflects on, and as Andrea states, I think that is probably, at least from my point of view, the best way to begin to search for a solution for this problem. As you know, he suggested many years ago two main drivers. First, that societies should be developed into modern and vibrant and full democracies, because it is, I think it is understandable, the only way to implement really the human rights and the human rights of more vulnerable populations. Second, the right to visit, as Andreas just told us about. I feel that this right should be, of course, regulated, but it is a good starting point also to this discussion of trying to find solutions to this problem. Promoting democracy and human rights in the world and in societies that do not cherish them, and secondly, finding ways of letting people to travel to different countries, because as you know, the borders are sometimes also huge problems. Again, the discussion that I feel that is transversal to this book implies this question of what should we do. I will leave here some topics for discussion that I could find in different chapters. Of course, the first topic is the moral duty to protect vulnerable populations, namely the ones that I told that are subject to intersectional discriminations, such as children, women, the elderly, the handicapped, because the way we face the problem of these even more vulnerable populations is also a way of constructing our common humanity. And of course, as you know, in some countries, some populations like women are intrinsically discriminated against. As Brinton said, the Global Compact on Refugees is also a good instrument, but is also a declaration of principles and of motivations. I think that someone that has responsibilities and interests in ethics and bioethics should go further than just to agree on common principles. Perhaps we should begin constructing a new common humanitarianism for humanity, for different countries, respecting, of course, the sovereignty of different countries. That's not at stake. But I think that in this moment, post-pandemic and not yet post-war in Ukraine, but recognizing the impacts of this tremendous war, I think that the world not only should build a new vision of humanity, but should reconstruct globalization. I think that the globalization was very important from an economic and cultural perspective. It had the enormous impact of diminishing considerably poverty in the world, namely in Africa and in Asia. So I have no doubts about the benefits of globalization, but we need for us a new wave of globalization, and a globalization that now is grounded not only in economics and in the free markets and free commerce of goods and services, but in welfare. As you know, in Europe, we have this vision of a welfare state that brought us together in the last 70 years. It is probably the main reason why we don't have war in Europe, in East Europe, West Europe, excuse me, after World War II. It is not only the economic growth, but it's mainly, in my point of view, the welfare state. So the perspective that all of us should have should be on an equal opportunity basis in the access to basic goods of society, namely the ones that are instrumental for our development, and for developing all our capacities, our talents to fulfill ourselves. And of course, healthcare and education are fundamental in this way. So I suppose that if in any way humanity could make this suggestion of creating more welfare conditions for all peoples in the world, probably the migrations and the reasons for the migrations would not be so important and so frequent. And of course, I defend that for a lot of years we need new and modern global governance arrangements. I think that the actual system of the United Nations, of the World Health Organization, and of UNICEF, well, I will not speak about UNESCO, must evolve to new patterns, involving also more deeply NGOs, more deeply private foundations, as we saw, for instance, in the vaccination, the worldwide vaccination for COVID-19, where a coalition between the United Nations system and private foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, NGOs, etc., paved the way to a new perspective of erasing inequalities in the world, namely in healthcare access and delivery. And the success was not probably what we expected, not because of lack of will or even of resources, but because many countries did not have the infrastructure to deliver with quality the vaccines to the COVID-19. So I feel that this book is a very good instrument and tool to let us think that, and whoever thinks on ethics and bioethics has this special responsibility, at least I feel that way, to promote a new way for the world to come together, respecting, of course, national boundaries, national sovereignty, and the free will of the peoples. That this is not at stake, but there must be some way so that the supranational organization just are not looking to what happens, but has some capacity to act. In conclusion, I would like to congratulate all the authors of this excellent book that I will suggest to anyone interested, and even also to our students, because I think that a problem, even in modern democracies, is that people are getting super specialized, and they should have a global view of problems if we really want to change the way we are developing. Then another suggestion, I would say, I would like to leave here, and I think it is very appropriate, is that as global health and as climate action, I feel that dealing appropriately with forced migration should be considered a global public good. I think the pandemic by the COVID-19 showed us that there are really problems that no country alone, the even stronger, rich, developed countries in any perspective can deal with in an isolated way. And I think migration should be another good examples, a global public good. So it is not something for the European Union to solve, or the United States, or whatever the country, but this should be considered a global public good that should enroll and involve different international players, namely the civil society. I believe in civil society, not in political organizations, even supranational ones. I think that the civil society has this capacity to change it, to have a voice that is really an independent voice. And so I feel that this book can also contribute to this perspective of considering the migrations and the effects of migrations as a global public good that should be dealt with in this perspective. And of course, the example of the European Union, well, I'm Portuguese and I'm also European, is again a good example. From my personal view, of course, I'm biased, but for my personal view, is an excellent civilizational project, because it was possible to bring together nearly 500 million people with very different languages, very different traditions, very different cultures, different religions, in common projects, in common ideals. Of course, grounded in human rights and human dignity. That is the starting point. But the fact is that after this pandemic and during this war, these values are more modern and more important than ever, and they help creating what I stated before, an European identity. So it is possible to have a national identity and to have a supranational identity. And I think that nowadays, perhaps not 2 years or 4 ago, but nowadays, with the creation of the new Bauhaus, the new cultural project of Europe, with the creation of the European Union of Health, etc. So huge, large-scale European Union projects that enroll and involve everyone. We can create this new identity, and I think it is an example for other parts of the world. To conclude, and I'm looking at my dearest friend, Juan Jorge Michel Farinha, I wish that he and all his team keeps promoting these global challenges and views and universal ideals through the cinema and bioethics, as he does so good and so well, and as he pointed out also in this book. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Nunes. I can see that there are some of the authors present here, so if you want to comment or participate, please feel free to do it. I will give the floor to Eduardo Díaz-Amado, who is the director of the Bioethics Institute at the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana in Colombia, author and co-editor of the book.
Thank you, Andrea. You hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us today, this celebration. Thank you to Brighton for your generous, warm words, for your detailed review of our book. It's really good to hear that our book has provoked these kind of reflections. And thank you, Rui, for your words as well, because you have reminded us about many of our most important moral duties today in a globalized world. As Hippocrates says, life is short, art is long, and the opportunity fleeting. So I promise my words is not going to take long. Just a few words to share with you this opportunity. I'm going to read some and comment others. Good morning for everyone from Colombia, and thanks for joining us today in this special occasion to launch our book Forced Displacement in Conflict Scenarios, Ethics and Human Rights Perspectives. A book that took us more than 2 years, almost 3 years of work to be ready. Thanks to the authors whose contributions make of this book an important source of information and inspiration for anyone who is interested in a better understanding this sad and unfortunately extended phenomenon of our time, the forced displacement, the forced migration. Examining particular cases and scenarios, for example, in Latin America, Europe, and Africa, we wanted to offer a critical perspective on the causes, expressions, and consequences of this serious problem that affects millions of people worldwide. Millions have had to flee their homes. Millions have lost their properties, their families, and their territories. We are not only biological beings or bodies, we are social creatures. The meaning of life is deeply linked to emotional, cultural, territorial, religious, and familiar ties. We are completely human if we remain together. We are happy today because the work is done. Yes, our book is here and is available for all. It is free access. We have already sent the link to download it. Please share it with your colleagues and friends. The best payment for a writer or a researcher is to hear that their work was read, commented, quoted, and criticized. Yes, we are happy because today we finally launched this book, but at the same time, I would say that happiness is not the only emotion present among us. We celebrate this success. It was a hard task to edit this book, but just looking around the world, there are many reasons to grieve, to complain, to feel down and think about us. We human beings, why we continue causing pain and suffering to each other. There is no one reason to accept that there are people whose fate, whose destiny is to be denied or to be expelled. Forced displacement is not just an academic topic, an interesting research topic, is a reason or a reason that justifies the bureaucracy of international political bodies and organizations. Forced displacement is a nightmare from which humankind must wake up. Ethics is a way to wake up. Through ethics, we can open our eyes to finish that nightmare by creating new subjectivities, new attitudes, new feelings, new insights that lead us to real actions and transformations. But not the same eyes with which we watch TV or Twitter. No, we need the eyes, or I talk about the eyes of our hearts and our reason in order to comprehend, to see the other, the different, the dispossessed as our brother or our sister or our relatives. Ethics is not only about arguments or statements or logic. It is also about certain values and feelings like solidarity, empathy, justice, to help the others, but also about shamefulness, to avoid going to the bed at night without being touched by the crying and despair of those who have lost everything. We cannot remain blind before the other who doesn't have a safe place to live. I would like to quote some lines of the chapter I wrote with Dr. Andres Cubillos, a colleague of mine here at the Javeriana University, for our book. Quote, "For displacement cannot be seen as a minor problem and deserves an approach that accounts for the economic, political, and socio-demographic aspects involved and points out the profound ethical and bioethics at stake. As stated by the International Bioethics Committee, the terrible suffering of forcibly displaced persons shocks the conscience of humanity and the international community. The images that we often see of people having to flee from their countries of origin or even within their own country to seek refuge, protection, and a better future elsewhere cannot be taken as just news. They are an indicator of the degree of our time's political, cultural, social, and ethical development. After all, we all inhabit this world, but not all are recognized as citizens, which profoundly affects these people. In this case of refugees, unlike the displaced, citizenship is lost. In any case, the state has different obligations which it must assume vis-a-vis the refugee and the displaced person. It is not possible to remain calm while millions of people do not have recognition of rights, citizenship, and do not have the minimum means to subsist uprooted and agreeing with the government, condemned to live in a permanent state of exception, in a no man's land and being no one, a condition that is aggravated when it comes to forgotten refugees, a category that indicates those who are no longer talked about and who have been suspended from a refugee camp indefinitely. That is why we must emphasize the possibility of fully guaranteeing citizenship. This concept of citizenship would fully guarantee life as social, ethical, and political individuals. Quote, "Well, there is much to do, as long as there are people, persons, communities in the world who are forced to leave behind their homes. We cannot rest. We cannot consider themselves as a truly human civilization until one day we all human beings live in our common home, the earth, together." Thanks especially to Carlos Nupia, who gifted us with a beautiful foreword. Thank you for the very well.
Thank you so much, Eduardo, and to the presenters. Thank you very much, Brinton and Professor Nunes. We have a question in the chat from Professor Fariña, and he's saying, in relation to the participation from, no, in relation, sorry, to the question from Dr. Ruin Nunes, what can be done to mitigate this reality? And he also adds, I would like to know Brinton-Like's opinion regarding the second and third axis of her intervention. I don't know if there is any other question or the
comments.
Or comments, maybe the co-authors. I can see Boyin Rakik, I can see Oliver Finney. There's also Grace Madu from Nigeria. Professor Stefanos, I can see you as well. He's from Nigeria as well. There is Fabian Duagon.
I think, Andrea, that perhaps we can
Alison.
talk. We can open the microphone.
We can open the mic. Yeah, so we
just up the hand and raise hand.
Oliver is raising his hand.
I just wanted to say
hi, Oli.
Hello, I'm heard. I just wanted to say congratulations to all who have been part of this book, and thanks and congratulations to Andrea and Eduardo for it, and thanks for my own co-authors for our chapter as well. I think one of the important things about these times is that one of the questions we always have is, what can we do practically in situations? How can we help influence things? And I think at the very least, every time we raise our voice, every time we put pen to paper, every time we publish something, we add to the voices of the people who are standing in solidarity with people who are suffering migration, suffering destitution, suffering human rights abuses. And at the very least, once we do that, we're bearing witness, we're raising our voices, we're saying we're here. So I think it's important. Everything we do is important. And this is one of the things that is great to see. So that was it, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Boyan, yeah.
Yes, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where we are. I also would like to thank the editors and the co-authors of and my co-authors for our common work. I have just quite short comment on what Professor Rui Nunes said. I think that is actually very important, that and it comes down to the issue that ethics has to be cosmopolitan, otherwise it's not proper ethics. Because if it is not cosmopolitan, then we make differences among people. We attach different values to people, and years ago I wrote an article. I remember that very well, about international relations in Immanuel Kant's theory, and usually it is interpreted on the basis of his work towards perpetual peace, where he promotes federalism. But in fact, in his later works, and I show there why they are more important than towards perpetual peace, like religion within the boundaries of mere reason, he actually stated that, talking about what he called the Ethical Commonwealth, his visionary mind stated that as well, that if it is not cosmopolitan, then it is not ethics. It's something else. It may be law, or we can call it the way we like, but ethics implies that we attach the same value to different people. We are no better, perhaps we are worse than the Syrian or Ukrainian refugees and so on. So I think that that type of awareness should imbue us, instead of just stating that we attach the same value to different ethnic groups and so on. We should really think in that way and honestly think about it in that way. That is the comment I felt I had to make, and that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you. There is somebody else, or so?
Diego? Andrea?
Yeah.
I don't know if Rui wants to answer the question that is in the chat, on the chat.
We have the question that Professor Fariña made for Rui and for Brinton. So for
Brinton, yes.
For Professor Rui Nunes is, what can be done to mitigate this reality?
Okay.
It's a big question.
Well, I'm only an interested interested person in bioethics, so I don't have, of course, any valuable answer, but nevertheless, I felt deeply what I stated, that first of all, I agree with Oliver that any statement is a valuable one. Of course it is, and that's why I feel that this book is so important, and that it should be, it should be developed large scale. I suppose that we could do it. I'm not sure. Probably Vojin can speak about it. We could do it also in international sharing bioethics. So any statement, and namely a book of this dimension and intensity, of course, is a valuable tool. But for my generation, I feel that we have an awkward sensation about the world. That for almost all my life, I saw the world developing in a very interesting way, namely in Europe. As I stated, in my own country, the levels of development, namely since we are in the European Union, grew steadily, and Portugal was an underdeveloped country 40 years ago. And now I think it's pretty developed. It is the third safer country in the world in 40 years. So we are not condemned to any kind of place or level of development. But of course, I am troubled, and I feel that in every modern democracy, people of my generation is worried about the world we are leaving to our children. Or reframing the question, are they going to live better than we are or not? And probably the answer is no. And so I feel that this is, of course, a very important issue, migrations, but should be approached in a multi-sectorial way, not only in this problem, but other development problems of the world, namely climate action, namely problems of the digital transition that is going to change profoundly the world, namely the human conditions, because as you know, over half of the employments will vanish in a couple of years. In Europe and in Portugal, we have a long-standing practice of more than 20 years of a universal income, but many countries do not have it. So what will happen to people in this transition? So I'm not trying to answer, but to comment that my personal feeling is that taking into account that really people have the right to visit and to go to other places, and the European Union is a good example. We have many youngsters that go from Portugal to Spain, to Germany, to France, to the United Kingdom before the Brexit, etc. And the other way around, we have millions of people traveling to Portugal nowadays. And we feel it is a positive step. So what can we do so that these practices are global ones? What steps should be made? What kind of global arrangement should be proposed? My personal point of view is that this pandemic, and of course this war, but mainly the pandemic, showed a failure of global institutions. And of course we had the insight of, and science had the insight of developing in a record time the vaccine for COVID-19, because otherwise I'm not sure what our destiny would be. So to sum up, my deep concern is, of course, all we can do, we should do, But perhaps the ones of us that deal with these issues and with ethics, as Wajin just stated, have this special responsibility of coming together and proposing worldwide solutions, because I don't think that my optimism in the past is so profound nowadays. And I would like to leave my daughter a world better than the one that I was brought on, and I feel that something should be done at a supranational level. I feel that way. It is difficult because no country wants to limit its own sovereignty. It is an obvious conclusion. But again, the example of the European Union is a very insightful one, because I think a nice equilibrium was found, and we live very well with this equilibrium, and that's the reason why some countries want to come together with us and not living with the example without the example of the United Kingdom, that I still don't understand why they chose that way. But nevertheless, that's my main concern, is well, what should be our answers, because just for instance, claiming to give citizenship to everyone, we could speculate on that from an intellectual perspective, but then as we saw even in European Union countries, then many peoples will not accept it. So we must reach another level of equilibrium, I feel. And well, I don't have the answer, of course, but I think that we should also discuss this issue. Perfect.
Thank you so much. So we have just maybe maximum 10 minutes. So there is, I would like to read a comment. We have the question for Brinton from Professor Fariña, but I would like to read the comment that Grace left in the chat. It's from Professor Istifanos from Nigeria as well. Forced migration is a huge problem in Africa, especially in Nigeria. The role of peace, education, peaceful means of conflict resolution, equality, fairness, and social justice cannot be overemphasized. So we have this last question for Brinton from Professor Fariña, and he's asking if he would like to know your opinion, Brinton, regarding the second and third axis of your intervention.
Right, I'll try and be very brief, but I too am of the generation of Professor Nunes, and I take great inspiration from the massive social movements in the world today, from those people who are focused not so much on rights, but on responsibilities. And through the indigenous knowledge systems that I mentioned earlier, I think that the work of Arturo Escobar, the Colombian anthropologist who was recently honored at the Latin American Studies Association meetings with the Oxfam Diskin Award, in which he actually identifies what he calls as 6 concepts that might help us push towards new ways of thinking and new ways of acting and new ways of being. And many of them do draw on some of the ideas nascent in indigenous communities. I think the Portuguese scholar Bonaventura de Sousa Santos talks about the difference between wanting to go to the moon, in which he says he would like to go with those academics from the Northern Hemisphere that have been deeply grounded in science, but if he wants to survive on the earth, he prefers to go with the indigenous communities who have survived for centuries despite the imperial colonial powers. And I do think that we see within some of these movements, and young people are basically joining some of these movements, opportunities for thinking differently about our responsibilities to the earth, our oneness with the earth. I think the comment about conflict resolution, equality, fairness, etc., or Eduardo's comments, and some of the ideas about actions taken through solidarity offer us a recognition that what we have inherited as universal human rights, as critically important as they have been, do not understand the earth and territories and waters as living systems that also need to be respected, and that we need to rethink our relationships as all living systems. For me, that's been one of the biggest challenges of recent years, and COVID-19 has highlighted the extraordinary results of not taking those systems. So I actually think that we are leaving our next generation and the one after that the opportunities, if they can listen to the waters, the territories, and all living systems, and begin to rethink both the ways in which interdependence at the local level needs to be networked to create systems that operate beyond. And then probably somewhat provocatively, and I have this debate on a regular basis with my colleague Dan Canstrom, who's a lawyer and who absolutely disagrees with me, but I am a fan of open borders. I actually think we have to provocatively engage with conversations about why we have created this notion that borders need to keep people out. And secondly, I'm deeply informed by the work of Barbara Sosteata, who is an anthropologist and theologian, who was an unauthorized migrant and who is finding that many, many migrants don't want citizenship. They want the right to work. They want the right to everyday living, and that we need to, again, rethink, take the recommendations in the last chapter in this book that say we need to think of a creative discourse for listening more deeply to people that are not in this symposium, but who are on the ground migrating, and move towards some of those as actions. I see those as actions we can take.
Thank you very much. I don't think we don't have more time. Eduardo, do you want to close the event?
No, I am so happy with this event. I am really happy because we have been exchanging multiple ideas, and I think that perhaps with these ideas and comments, we have now new horizons to write more books, to propose new ways to try to solve this situation, because perhaps one of the main ideas today is that it's not enough to analyze the situation, to share arguments, but also to consider possible solutions to the problems that immigration and forced migration implies. So I am happy because of that. I think that today we finish the book, but we start new projects. So my hope is that we continue this exchange academically and social and personally with all of you. Thank you very much for your patience with this book, because we took a long time to edit the book, but finally the book is here. So I hope, Andrea, that we will have new projects to share and to speak of. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
just to add to Eduardo, I want to thank all of you. We have been exchanging emails for so many time, and the waiting was worthwhile. I am very happy with the book. I'm very grateful for all your collaborations, and I really hope that this book, that we have the book in our hands, in our digital hands, could evolve into something else. We will see. But I think this other kind of level, now the conversation is open and it's our responsibility where we are going to guide this conversation. So from my side, it's open and we will be in contact just to see how to pursue this working process. Yeah. So thank you very, very much, and hope to see you soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, see you.
Thank you, thank you,
Bye-bye.
thank you very much.
Bye.
Goodbye.